Greetings, children. Welcome to the second part of human body and organ systems. Let's start.
The skeleton has 206 bones. Functions of bones: 1. It supports the body. 2. Protection of soft organs. 3. Bone help in movement along skeletal muscles. 4. Bones store minerals and fats. 5. Helps in blood cell formation. The skull.
The skull protects the brain.
The human skull is made up of 8 cranial bones that surround and protect the brain, and 14 facial bones that form the underlying structure of the face and support for the teeth. With the exception of the mandible, the bones of the skull articulate with each other through joints known as sutures. Throughout the skull, holes known as foramina serve as passageways for blood vessels and nerves. Bones on the surface of the skull encase the brain, protect sensory organs, and serve as attachment sites for the muscles of the head and neck. These bones include the occipital bone, parietal bones, temporal bones, and the frontal bone, as well as the nasal bones, the zygomatic bones, the maxilla, and the mandible. Other bones become more visible only when looking inside the skull. The sphenoid bone makes up the anterior base of the cranium. It is a butterfly-shaped bone with a central body and 2 pair of laterally projecting wings. These wings form portions of the orbit. The body of the sphenoid features a depression known as the sella turcica, which houses the pituitary gland. Located between the orbits, the ethmoid bone makes up a portion of the cranial floor and also the roof of the nasal cavity. An inferior projection, the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone, forms part of the nasal septum. The crista galli projects superiorly from the ethmoid bone and serves as the attachment point for the falx cerebri, a dural fold. Extending laterally from the crista galli is the cribriform plate, a perforated area through which the olfactory nerves pass. The 2 L-shaped palatine bones form the posterior third of the hard palate, part of the nasal cavity, and a portion of the orbit. The small, thin lacrimal bones make up the anterior portion of the medial wall of each orbit. A groove known as the lacrimal groove helps to form the nasolacrimal canal, which contains a duct that allows tears to travel to the nasal cavity. The vomer is an elongated, plow-shaped bone that forms the inferior and posterior part of the nasal septum. The internal and external skull bones articulate precisely, forming an intricate structure perfectly suited to its functions.
Ribs protect the lungs and the heart. There are 24 ribs which are arranged 12 on each side. Rib cage is formed by the vertebral column, ribs, and sternum and encloses the heart and lungs. There are 24 ribs which are arranged 12 on each side. The first 7 pairs of ribs join the breastbone known as sternum in the center of the chest. The front ends of the 8th and 10th pairs are connected to the ribs above them. The 11th and 12th pairs are called floating ribs, as they are anchored in place only by connective tissue, so they are
The spinal cord is a very important part of our central nervous system, the overall system that controls and coordinates the activities of our bodies.
Our brain is surrounded by the skull, while our spinal cord is surrounded by rings of bone called vertebrae, and both are covered by a protective membrane. Together, the vertebrae and membrane make up our spinal column, or our backbones. The backbone, which protects our spinal cord, starts at the base of our skull and ends just above our hips. The spinal cord is about 18 inches long and extends from the base of the brain down the middle of the back to just below the last rib in the waist area. The main job of the spinal cord is to be the communication system between the brain and the body by carrying messages that allow us to move and feel sensation. Our spinal nerve cells, called neurons, carry the messages to and from the spinal cord. These messages leave the spinal cord through openings in the vertebrae. Spinal nerve roots branch off the spinal cord in pairs, one going to each side of the body. Each nerve has a specific job for movement and feeling. They tell the muscles in your arms, hands, fingers, legs, toes, chest, and other parts of your body when and how to move. When a spinal cord injury occurs, sensation and movement may be interrupted, resulting in a temporary or permanent loss of function and paralysis. In general, the higher on the spinal cord the injury occurs, the greater loss of function the person may experience. The vertebrae are grouped into sections according to their location. For example, the 7 vertebrae in the neck are called the cervical vertebrae. The vertebrae are numbered top to bottom, from the head to the tailbone. The top vertebrae is called C1, the next is C2, C3, and so on. Cervical spinal cord injuries usually cause loss of function in the arms and legs, resulting in tetraplegia, which is also called quadriplegia. The next 12 vertebrae are called the thoracic vertebrae. The first, T1, is where the top rib attaches. Injuries in the thoracic region usually affect the trunk and legs and result in paraplegia. The lumbar vertebrae are the 5 vertebrae in the lower back between the thoracic vertebrae, where the ribs attach, and the pelvis, or hip bone. The sacral vertebrae run from the pelvis to the end of the spinal column. Injuries to the 5 lumbar vertebrae, L1 through L5, and similarly to the 5 sacral vertebrae, S1 through S5, generally result in some loss of functioning in the hips and legs.
Whether the cause of a spinal injury or illness is traumatic or non-traumatic, the damage affects the nerve fibers passing through the injured area. That can damage or weaken part or all of the corresponding muscles and nerves below the injury site. Doctors have already or will assign your loved one a level of injury that corresponds to the damage below the injury. In Chapter 5, we'll explain more about these injury levels and how they can impact you or your loved one. Right now, we'll move on to Chapter 3 to inform you about some things that may occur soon after the immediate spinal cord injury or illness.